Hi there, welcome back. Now, first of all, I would like to tell you that given the large number of requests I received, I have decided to introduce a mini course in the course. Starting from week 4 and until week 6, we will deal every week with survival analysis with a particular attention on PD and LGD and the lifetime issues that are related with these two quantities. Obviously, this will be an extra. All the rest of the course will stay the same. So this is just to offer you something more. Now, if we start with your questions, the first question was a request from Mike that asked me to provide codes for Moody's, KNV, and credit metrics on the same model of what we did with Merton's model. Now, the point is that credit metrics will be analyzed in detail in week 5, so I just ask for your patience in that sense. For Moody's KNV, you can find a simple code here below. Just uploading this code. It's a toy code because obviously, as we know, we don't have all the information about the empirical survival function. So I have just created a fake one just to let you know how the model works. I hope you will find it interesting enough. We then have a question from Ruben. Ruben asks what we are supposed to do with expected losses if PD and LGD are not independent. Now, in that case, we have that the expected losses are not just the product of the expectations of EAD, PD, and LGD. Now, let's start with the simplifying assumption in which EAD, the exposure at default, is independent from the PD and the LGD. We know that this is not true. Think of credit lines in which when the counterparty is approaching default, essentially it's trying to maximize the use of the resources, so the EAD increases as well. But let's assume that we have independence. In that case, we have that the expected losses will be the product of two expectations, the expectation of the EAD and the expectation of the product of PD and LGD. Now, if we assume that the dependence between PD and LGD is linear, or if we can approximate this dependence in a linear form, then we can use the relationship through the covariance, and we can express the expectation of the product as the product of the expectation plus the covariance. And then we can decide to express the covariance in terms of correlation and so on. The problem is that if the dependence is not linear, then the covariance and the correlation become somehow meaningless in terms of dependence, and we need to find something else. We will see in week 6 that we have the possibility of doing something more advanced. For example, we can use the marginal expected shortfall, and I think it will be an interesting week for you. Okay, then many of you asked me how we have to behave in those situations in which we do not have enough data. For example, when we have low frequency risks. This will be one of the topics of week 4. Week 4 will start in January. So you know that now we have a break for the holidays. We will see each other again in January. What can we do when we have not enough data? Actually, there are techniques we can use, and I'm pretty sure that in this framework I can really teach something new that you don't know. We can use tools from small area statistics or from the field I prefer, which is extreme value theory. So we will see how we can extrapolate as much information as we can from the few data we have. But I want to be honest, there are situations in which we have to give up. Okay, so we cannot do anything, we have to give up, we have to find something different than the quantitative models we may have in mind. But this is already a good result, because knowing one's limits it's something very good for a risk manager. And given the break, if I can give you a suggestion about a book to read, okay, maybe not really in these days, just relax and enjoy your holiday time. But a nice book that I suggest you to read sooner or later is Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit by Frank Knight. This is an old book, but it still contains very innovative ideas for the risk managers of today. Now, I'm putting a link again here below to the book. It's free of copyright at this very moment. You find the PDF, you can download it, and it's a very interesting reading. You will find very interesting concepts, like, for example, the impossibility of estimating all risks and a nice definition of uncertainty. It's not a manual, so it's really a nice essay that you can read in the evening before falling asleep, or maybe it's also the way to fall asleep sooner, okay? So I hope you can enjoy it. There is a question from Ella. Ella asks how to choose between quantitative and qualitative approaches. This is a good point, and unfortunately there is no single answer. So for sure the regulator prefers quantitative approaches, and this is evident if you read the documents. If you consider market risk, if you consider credit risk, if you consider liquidity risk, if you consider operational risk, you see that there is a preference for numbers that come from quantitative approaches. And I always like to make the example of operational risk. You know that this is a strange type of risk, and the modeling is not so advanced. So you really find the basic indicator approach or the standardized approach, and they are both comparable to the standardized approach of credit risk. If you go in the documents of the Basel Committee and you look for what they are telling us for what concerns the advanced measurement approaches, then you find that they are just asking us to develop something which is as good in terms of quantification of quantitative models as in the field of credit risk. So you really see that there is a stress on the quantitative side. Now, from my point of view as a statistician, if you ask for my opinion, obviously I have a preference for quantitative approaches. The point is that I believe that a quantitative model makes sense if the model is sound and if the data are sufficient. With sufficient, I mean sufficient in terms of quantity, number of observations, and quality, really the quality of the data we have. Because a model on the wrong data, a model with just a few data but that we cannot really exploit, in the best situation will give you wrong answers and unreliable estimates. In the worst situation can be really dangerous. And I would say even stupid to use a model, a very fancy model on the wrong data. So this is something that we have to take into consideration. From my point of view, qualitative approaches are very useful, but they need to be used to amend, to improve the results of quantitative approaches. For example, in order to avoid the problem of historical bias, or if you really have some strong information coming from experts. My background is a Bayesian background, so I'm a Bayesian statistician, so I really care about expert judgment, prior elicitation, but nevertheless, I think that data are very important. We have to develop quantitative approaches and to go on the qualitative side only in case in which we cannot really exploit all the information we have. We then have a question from Aryan, and Aryan tells us, my experience is that regulators are quite reluctant to accept the use of vendor models for internal rating-based approaches. How can the banks deal with this reluctance? Okay, this is a good point. It's true that there is somehow reluctance from the side of the regulators for the use of vendor models, especially under the foundation internal rating-based framework. For the advanced is less true, so it's more, it's easier to use vendors model. The problem is that after the crisis, so when we moved from Basel II to Basel III, we know that now there is a more conservative approach to credit risk. We are discussing about the introduction of capital floors, and that for sure is the big problem for vendors model, because what's the point of investing in something very expensive in order to reduce your capital requirements, to develop the fanciest model when then you have a capital floor. So obviously this is something that we have to take into consideration. And let me just tell you something quick about capital floors. Capital floors are like fences, and I always like to speak about the so-called fence paradox. Remember that fences can be very nice, but fences can also give you a false sense of security. And I'm not really sure that forcing everyone to be the same can really be something nice for the market. And how can a bank convince the regulator? In principle, if you comply with all the requirements and if the model is sound, the regulator cannot just say no, you cannot use this model. It has to motivate, so you can really start bargaining in that case. And my experience is that this is what happened and happens in the US or in Germany, at least on the basis of my consulting experience. For sure, what we have to say is that when you deal with advanced models, a clear and transparent documentation becomes fundamental. So it's really an issue that needs to be dealt with, because yes, you have to convince another person, another group of persons, so the documentation is important. And in the case of vendor model, this documentation should be transparent and available. So obviously, if the model is somehow a black box and you don't know what is happening, that will be difficult to sell to the regulator. Okay, so we are at the end of the first part of the course of our first 3 weeks. I hope you have enjoyed the course so far. We are still at the middle, so you will see that most of the contents we have introduced until now will be better developed in the rest of the course. I hope you will have a nice break, nice holidays. The course will start again in January, but obviously if you post your questions on the course forum, we will still collect them, and I will also answer some of the questions on the course forum, obviously the shortest one. I cannot guarantee I will be answering the day of Christmas, but you'll never know. Okay, goodbye.